Do you understand why I pulled you over, officer?
Sir, I believe I was driving within the speed limit.
When a simple traffic stop turns into a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never anticipated. His target? The very man who holds his future in his hands. The sun was beginning to set over the streets of Sacramento, brushing the sky with streaks of gold and amber. Eric Porter was heading home after a long day at the office. His sedan purred softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to let go of the day's tension. The radio murmured quietly in the background, a calming escape from the city's restless rhythm. As he neared a yellow light, he slowed just as it flicked to red. That's when blue and red lights suddenly flashed behind him, followed by the sharp wail of a police siren. Eric glanced into his rearview mirror, his brows knitting slightly. He eased his car to the side of the road and rolled down his window as a police cruiser stopped behind him. Out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s, a buzz cut, and a badge that gleamed on his chest. Larson adjusted his belt as he strode toward Eric's car, radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to control. "License and registration," Larson said briskly, his tone flat but edged with authority. Eric complied silently, reaching into his glove compartment for his registration and handing over his driver's license. His movements were calm and deliberate, though he could feel Larson's eyes studying him, probing for a reason to push further. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning closer to the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied evenly, his tone polite yet steady. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson said, though a trace of uncertainty flickered in his voice. Eric frowned slightly but nodded. "I see. I thought I slowed in time, but I understand." Larson didn't respond right away. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing as he examined Eric more intently. It was no longer a simple stop, at least not for Larson. His stance shifted subtly, as if he'd already decided this was about more than a traffic violation. The officer glanced down at the license in his hand. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked. Eric hesitated for a brief moment before replying, "I moved here a few months ago. The address is on the license." But Larson wasn't really listening. His questions had begun to carry an edge, just sharp enough to reveal that this wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. Eric's calm demeanor seemed to irritate him, and he leaned in closer. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Eric replied. His voice stayed steady, but the subtle tension in the air was impossible to miss. Larson wasn't seeing a driver anymore. He saw something else, something that triggered suspicion. Eric could feel the unease building, but he didn't flinch. Little did Officer Larson know, that calm exterior wasn't innocence. It was control. This was only the beginning. Larson took a step back, folding Eric's documents with exaggerated care before sliding them into his chest pocket. He straightened up, his expression shifting to something faintly smug, as if he'd already decided who Eric was. "Step out of the car for me," Larson ordered. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a moment, though his face remained unreadable. "Is there a particular reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone measured. Larson's lips twitched before he masked it. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Eric exhaled slowly and opened the door. As he stepped out, Larson's gaze flicked over him, sizing him up. Eric stood a little taller than the officer, his shoulders broad but his stance composed. His tailored suit spoke of professionalism. His polished shoes hinted at someone meticulous and self-assured. But none of that seemed to matter. Larson motioned toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Eric complied, moving calmly and deliberately. Is there something specific you're looking for, officer? Larson smirked faintly. Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. Can't be too careful. Eric turned slightly, meeting Larson's gaze. Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else? The question hit like a punch. For a moment, Larson's composure cracked. He straightened, his hand drifting toward his belt. More reflex than necessity. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question," Eric replied evenly. His voice free of defiance. Only a quiet firmness that seemed to unsettle the officer. Larson leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide." Eric let the silence hang for a beat before answering. "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Larson scoffed, but didn't respond. He stepped back, pacing a small circle in front of the car. The balance of power was shifting in ways he couldn't quite pin down. Eric wasn't reacting like most people did. There was no fear, no stammering, no nervous gestures. Instead, there was control, poise, and a calm so steady it set Larson on edge. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered, almost to himself. "Like you think you know what's going to happen next." Eric didn't take the bait. He tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Larson froze for half a second before turning to face him again. The smirk was gone, replaced by something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Eric's composure was throwing him off balance, and he didn't like it. As the silence deepened, the tension between them thickened, charged, electric. Larson was starting to realize this encounter wasn't unfolding the way he'd expected, but rather than back down, he doubled down. The real test was about to begin. Larson tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, his frustration barely hidden. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Eric. His gaze flicked back toward the sedan, as though searching for a justification he hadn't yet created. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Larson ordered, his voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons," he echoed, his tone incredulous, but still measured. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw tightened. For a moment, his composure cracked. "I'm not going to ask you again." Eric hesitated. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Larson approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt slicing through the tense silence. He began patting Eric down, quick and methodical. Larson's movements were rough, his hands lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search. It was an assertion of dominance, an attempt to provoke a reaction. But Eric didn't flinch. He didn't stiffen. He didn't even shift under the invasive scrutiny. "You're clean," Larson muttered finally, stepping back. The admission came grudgingly, as though it irritated him that he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. Eric turned to face him, calm but with eyes that cut sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done—" "I'm not done," Larson snapped, his voice rising. The words came out too fast, betraying his need to maintain control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric folded his arms, his posture relaxed, despite the crackling tension between them. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said evenly. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "That's so. You a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled faintly. "Or something." The ambiguity in his reply only seemed to needle Larson further. He stepped closer, invading Eric's space, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Listen, You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this? Eric met his gaze without blinking. I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here. The words hung in the air, calm, but heavy. A challenge disguised as composure. Larson took the bait. Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always. He stopped abruptly. The unfinished words lingered like smoke, toxic even in their silence. Eric's expression didn't change, but his posture did, subtly, unmistakably. He'd caught exactly what Larson hadn't said. People like me, Eric repeated, his voice soft, but laced with quiet power. Larson stiffened, realizing too late that he'd crossed a line he couldn't take back. You know what I mean, he muttered, though his tone had lost the confidence it carried just moments before. I think I do, Eric replied quietly. His calm was no longer passive. It was razor-sharp, cutting through pretense like a blade. And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago. Larson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, Larson looked uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The balance of power had shifted, and now it was Larson who stood on unsteady ground. But the true moment of reckoning was still to come, and it would be one he'd never forget. Eric's voice broke through the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. Officer, I think it's time you knew who I am. Larson's brows furrowed, irritation flashing across his face. I don't care who you are, he snapped, but the faint crack in his tone betrayed him. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow, deliberate. I'm reaching for my badge, he said evenly, his eyes locked on Larson's. No need for theatrics. I just want you to see it. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken weight. Larson's eyes followed every motion as Eric withdrew a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. Eric Porter, he said, his tone calm, almost casual. Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larson froze. His gaze darted from the badge back to Eric's face, searching desperately for any sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor there, only quiet authority, and something colder beneath it, disappointment. Internal Affairs, Larson echoed, his voice cracking slightly. Yes. Eric cut in, saving him the effort. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people who wear this badge actually honor what it stands for. Larson's face drained of color. The confident posture he'd worn like armor began to crumble, piece by piece. He took an involuntary step back, his hand dropping away from his belt, as though the very symbol of his authority had suddenly become too heavy to bear. Eric stepped forward, closing the distance Larson had instinctively created. Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson? He asked, his voice calm but piercing. Larson didn't answer. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd walked into quicksand, with no idea how to escape. It's not the profiling, Eric continued, his tone measured. Though that's bad enough. It's not even the baseless escalation. He paused, long enough for the weight of his words to sink in. It's that you did all of this, without ever realizing who you were talking to. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. Larson opened his mouth, but no words came. Eric's gaze held firm, steady, unrelenting. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect, Eric finished for him. His tone wasn't angry, but the words carried the weight of a verdict. And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in that uniform. Larson's shoulders slumped, the full weight of the truth pressing down on him. He glanced once more at the badge in Eric's hand, as if hoping it might vanish if he looked away long enough. Eric took a slow step back, giving Larson a moment to breathe, but his voice never softened. "Here's what's going to happen," he said evenly. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson's lips parted, but hesitation froze him mid-thought. He seemed torn between defiance and surrender. The silence stretched, until Eric leaned forward slightly, his tone dropping lower, sharper. "You're going to hear from me again," he said. "Not as the driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man responsible for deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Larson swallowed hard. Color rose in his face as the gravity of the moment sank in. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Eric's license and registration, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he handed them over. Eric accepted them without a word, tucking the documents neatly into his wallet. Then he turned toward his car, one hand resting on the driver's side handle. Before getting in, he looked back over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Larson's one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," he said quietly. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." Eric slid into his car and started the engine. The low hum filled the silence as he pulled away, leaving Larson standing alone in the fading Sacramento light, his confidence shattered, his future uncertain. But for Eric, this wasn't over. Not even close. The drive home was quiet, but his mind wasn't. The encounter replayed again and again, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had dealt with like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, Eric had the authority to act. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of his office as Eric sat behind his desk, the badge gleaming beside a stack of reports that would soon change everything. At the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, a file lay open on Eric's desk. Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, vague misunderstandings that had never been fully addressed. Eric leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his mind turning over the broader implications. Larson wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom of something deeper, a problem that ran through the very veins of the department, and Eric wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A soft knock at the door broke his train of thought. His assistant, Linda, stepped in holding a neat stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels asked me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, accepting the files. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, catching the weight in his tone. "Of course," she said quietly before slipping back out. Eric's gaze returned to Larson's file, but his thoughts were already beyond the page. This wasn't about one man or one incident. It was about a culture that had allowed someone like Larson to believe his behavior was acceptable. And if Eric knew one thing for certain, it was this: culture starts at the top. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in the conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening carefully as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated issue. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Eric replied, leaning forward. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels looked at him, the weight of the conversation clear in his eyes. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. Clapperboard title suggestion: The Officer Who Refused to Stay Silent, A Fight for Integrity in Blue. At the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, a file lay open on Eric Porter's desk. Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and misunderstandings that had quietly faded away without real accountability. Eric leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his expression heavy with thought. Larson wasn't an outlier. He was a reflection, a symptom of a deeper, systemic problem. And Eric wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock broke his focus. Linda, his assistant, stepped inside holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss." She hesitated, reading the weight in his tone. "Of course," she said softly before leaving. Eric's eyes returned to Larson's file, but his thoughts were elsewhere. This wasn't about one man. It was about a culture that allowed behavior like this to thrive, a culture that started at the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in the conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense stare, listened as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said firmly. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated case. It's proof that we still have a lot of work to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up, but we've always handled it internally, quietly. And that's the problem," Eric shot back. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels studied him for a moment. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, hands clasped. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." Eric didn't flinch. "Good," he said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind: meetings, interviews, late nights surrounded by stacks of reports. Eric worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and hosting public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for something bigger, a turning point that forced the department to look itself in the mirror. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Eric didn't hide his involvement. He sat across from Larson during the proceedings, watching as the officer squirmed under the weight of accountability. The hearing ended with a suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Larson. It was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at a podium before a packed community hall. Officers, city officials, and residents all gathered under one roof. He didn't speak of blame. He spoke of responsibility, the shared duty to build a system that worked for everyone. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for every person they encounter. That's the badge I believe in. And that's the badge we're building, together." The applause was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As he stepped down from the podium, he scanned the crowd, some faces skeptical, others hopeful, but all listening. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. Direct hit closing narration. For YouTube outro. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to real change. Subscribe for more stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right.